Jemmy raised a banner. 20 enslaved men formed behind it. The column began to move. This was not chaos. This was not a riot. This was an army organized, marching, unstoppable. America would spend 285 years trying to erase what happened next. September 9th, 1739. Before dawn broke, 6 in the morning, the air was still cold. A Sunday chosen because planters knelt in churches while patrols slept. The low country lay silent under darkness. Jemmy moved first. He and his men crashed through Hutchinson's store near the Stono River, shattering quiet. Weapons waited inside. They took them. Then they walked back out into the morning and formed a line. A banner rose skyward. Drums split the air. One word erupted into the Carolina dawn. Liberty, liberty, liberty. That word, on that morning, was the first organized cry for freedom on American soil. Paul Revere would not ride for 36 more years. Independence was 37 years away. Jemmy got there first. Most Americans have never heard his name. The Kingdom of Congo was not a society of scattered villages. It had military structure, written records, and Catholic tradition by the 1600s. Men raised there knew how to organize, how to march, how to lead. When Jemmy formed that column, he was not improvising. He was drawing on something his captors never imagined he carried, a military education. They moved south along the road towards Spanish Florida, where freedom was promised to those who reached it. As they marched, more enslaved people joined the column. They carried weapons taken from the store and from plantations along the route, not fleeing in the night, not hiding, marching in daylight. He moved at the front, where every eye could find him. That detail is worth holding on to. By the time Lieutenant Governor William Bull spotted the column from horseback, it was too late to stop it quietly. Bull rode hard to raise the alarm. But here is what nobody tells you. The rebellion had already lasted hours before any organized colonial resistance appeared. At least 25 white colonists were killed across that 10-mile march. That was the highest death toll from an enslaved uprising in the history of colonial America, higher than anything before it, higher than anything that would follow in the colonial period. The colonists who died were not random victims of chaos. They were targeted at specific plantations along the route south. 2 of them were spared, according to accounts from the period. One man was known to treat enslaved people with some degree of decency. The column passed his house and kept moving. Jemmy was making decisions, moral decisions, in the middle of a military operation. The evidence tells a different story than the one most people were taught. What they hid was this. Stono was not a panic. It was planned. The Sunday timing was chosen with purpose. The store was targeted because it held weapons. The route south toward Florida was not guessed at randomly. Spanish Florida had been offering freedom to escaped enslaved people since 1733. He had a destination, a formation, a flag, and a plan. A battle followed. The column broke. Some rebels scattered into the woods. Some were captured immediately. Jemmy and a small group continued moving south. A wanted man, hunted by an entire colonial government, still not taken. The colonial record of what happened to him after that is incomplete. Historians believe he was executed, but the exact account did not survive in the official record. That gap in the record is not an accident. What South Carolina did next tells you everything about how afraid they were. Within a year, the Colonial Assembly passed the Negro Act of 1740. It was one of the most restrictive laws placed on enslaved people in colonial American history. It banned enslaved people from growing their own food, earning money, or learning to read. A man they buried in an incomplete record had terrified a colony into rewriting its laws. The colony did not just punish the rebels. It punished the memory of them. There is a difference, and that difference is the story of what came next. Within weeks of the battle at the Edisto River, South Carolina's Shaken Assembly convened. The men in that room were not only afraid of another uprising, they were afraid of what the uprising meant. Jemmy had showed something the colony could not afford to let stand as fact, that enslaved people could organize, plan, command, and nearly succeed. The Assembly responded fast. First, they drafted the Negro Act of 1740. Second, they controlled what the revolt would be called. Those 2 actions worked together, And the second one has lasted longer than the first. The threat was not just military. It was ideological. A man in chains had led an army. That image, left intact, was more dangerous than any weapon taken from Hutchinson's store. Because here is the truth about erasure. It does not need to burn a document. It only needs to choose which version of events gets repeated. South Carolina chose. The official accounts filed after the rebellion described the rebels as a, quote, riotous collection of slaves. Not soldiers, not an organized column. That word was chosen with precision. A riot has no general, no flag, no plan, no destination. A riot is chaos, and chaos does not threaten the idea of slavery. A military operation does, and it transformed everything Jemmy had fought to become. The assembly's language did something specific. It moved Jemmy from commander to instigator, from a man with a plan to a man who started something he could not control. Their heads were mounted on stakes along the road where they had marched. The message was not just about death. It was about what happened to people who remembered themselves as soldiers. Stakes along a road were one mechanism for that forgetting. Language in an official record was another. Both worked on the same target, the idea that resistance was possible and could succeed. The record splits in two at this exact moment. One version came down through colonial dispatches, official reports, and printed summaries that reached the public. The other described a formation, a banner, and a destination, and required deliberate historical recovery to resurface. Which version reached you first? Colonial governors sent dispatches to London describing what had happened at Stono. Those dispatches shaped how British officials understood enslaved resistance in the American colonies. Not once did the official correspondence to London describe a military column moving under a flag. By the time the rebellion appeared in printed accounts available to the public, it had been twisted into a fearful warning. Enslaved people could never be trusted with freedom. The lesson drawn was not about the sophistication of the resistance. The lesson drawn was about the failure of colonial surveillance. Jemmy disappeared inside that lesson. His name appears in almost no colonial record by name. He is referred to, where he appears at all, as the ringleader, with no further detail offered. A man who led a military column for 10 miles, survived a battle, and remained free for nearly a month, earned one word, ringleader. That word, enslaved, was meant to shrink him, to make him believe he was less. And this is where it gets worse. The Negro Act of 1740 is frequently cited as one of the harshest slave codes in Colonial B, America. But the standard telling of that law almost never names what caused it. Students in American classrooms learned about the law for generations without learning about the man whose actions forced the assembly to write it. The cause was separated from the effect. Jemmy's column was removed from the historical chain that produced one of colonial America's most significant legal documents. That separation was not the work of one person in one room. It was repeated across textbooks, curricula, and institutional histories for more than 2 centuries. Listen to the colonists' logic here, because it reveals everything they feared. The men in that room believed they were managing a crisis in real time. Their paramount concern was preventing future rebellions. Suppressing hope became governance. Controlling the language in the official record felt, to them, like governance. Calling Jemmy a ringleader instead of a commander was not lying by their moral framework. It was framing an event in terms that would not inspire repetition. The cold logic of that decision is that it worked for nearly 300 years. An eyewitness account, sometimes called the account of the Negro insurrection in South Carolina, was preserved from the months following the battle. That account described tactical coordination that exceeded what colonial authorities expected. It sat in an archive for most of the 20th century, available to anyone trained to find it. Not burned, not locked, just left where most people would never look. And history moved forward as if the other version had never existed. Historians found it alongside other fragments the Colonial Assembly never thought to clean out: church logs, ship manifests. A single account written close enough to the event to carry real detail. The distance between that archive and an American classroom is not geography. A decision made by people with names and job titles passed down like an inheritance of silence. South Carolina's public school curriculum did not include the Stono Rebellion as a planned military action until, well, into the late 20th century. Before that, if Stono appeared at all, it appeared as a cautionary note about colonial unrest, a footnote about the dangers of lax oversight, not a story about a man who organized, marched, commanded, and nearly won. The children sitting in those classrooms were not stupid. They were just given incomplete materials by a system that had reasons for the gaps. What gets named in a curriculum is a political decision, not an educational one. South Carolina School Board had that authority and used it for more than 2 centuries. That is not a metaphor. That is a policy with a paper trail and a voting record. Consider what vanished in that silence. The names, the stories, the resistance itself. Jemmy's name does not appear in a single colonial dispatch sent to London after the rebellion. Not once, in any official correspondence, was the leader of the column identified by name. He marched 10 miles through contested territory, held his column under fire, evaded capture for weeks. And the empire that hunted him could not bring itself to write his name in an official letter. That is not oversight. That is erasure. If you name a man, you confirm he existed as a man. Calling him the ringleader and moving on was a way of keeping him less than human in the prosaic, written record. The written record is what became the history. The history is what became the curriculum. Your history class had a syllabus. Someone chose every name on it. Jemmy was not there. That chain of control stretched longer than most people ever learned, decades of enforcement. From 1740 to 1865 is 125 years. The Negro Act shaped colonial law. Its slave codes outlasted the colony itself. From 1865 to 1965, Reconstruction rose and fell as Jim Crow replaced slave codes. Black history taught in American schools was filtered through segregationist state boards in the South. After 1965, local control of educational standards kept the gaps in place for decades more. Time does not erase history. People do. Here is a number worth holding. 44. That is roughly how many rebels are believed to have been killed or executed following the battle. Based on the accounts that survived, the rebels' bodies became warnings, displayed along the very road they had marched. The men who ordered that understood something about memory. They knew that what people see, they remember. And what they remember shapes what they believe is possible. An open-air lesson posted for every enslaved person who passed that way. About the cost of believing you could win. They ran 2 campaigns at the same time. A military one to stop the rebellion and an informational one to stop the idea. The military victory took weeks. The informational one ran for nearly 3 centuries. Jemmy carried more than military training from the Kingdom of Congo. He carried memory. He carried a framework for understanding collective action, one rooted in a tradition the colonists had no reference point for. Congo's ruling class had been participating in transatlantic networks throughout the 17th century. The men who planned Stono were not strangers to the concept of coordinated resistance. They brought it with them across the water, and the people who enslaved them never saw it coming. That detail was not preserved in the version taught in South Carolina schools. South Carolina classrooms erased the Kongolese military strategies that shaped this rebellion's fierce, calculated resistance, because that would require acknowledging that what arrived on those ships was not ignorance, it was knowledge, organized, specific, and dangerous to the people who held the whips. The colony needed a different story. Instead, it got rage. It got a ringleader. It got a cautionary tale about surveillance failure. What it buried was a commander, a formation, a flag, and a word shouted into the Carolina air at 6 in the morning on a September Sunday: liberty. That word roared from those lungs, in that blood-soaked moment, echoes as America's oldest documented cry for freedom. It was said 37 years before the Declaration of Independence put the same idea onto paper and attributed it to men who owned the people who said it first. South Carolina's representatives at the Continental Congress knew what a rebellion looked like, because their colony had lived through one. They wrote about liberty with the memory of Jemmy somewhere in the room, and they wrote his people into the document as property, not as the originators of the argument. That substitution, from originator to property, is the foundation of the historical erasure. It did not start with a textbook. It started with a political decision made in 1776. In 2019, the 400-year commemoration of the arrival of enslaved Africans in what would become the United States produced significant public discussion about how that history had been taught. Stono appeared in some of those conversations. Jemmy's name surfaced less often. The rebellion was acknowledged. The general was not fully restored. The rebellion lived on. Its architect faded into deliberate obscurity. That logic does not require a conspiracy. It only requires a habit of reaching for the version of the story that keeps the original hierarchy intact. Jemmy as a ringleader is less threatening than Jemmy as a commander. A riot is less threatening than a military operation. The Stono River still runs through Charleston County, South Carolina. A commemorative plaque acknowledging the rebellion was installed in 2013. 274 years after the morning, Jemmy walked out of Hutchinson's store with a weapon in his hands and a destination in his mind. The marker exists now. The name on it is there. But a marker is not a curriculum, and a curriculum is not a culture. And a culture is not a country that has genuinely reckoned with what was done on that road. 285 years later, the question is still the same, not whether it happened. The Stono Rebellion still echoes today. Will we finally hear their story?